Hi, Sebastian, and thanks so much for joining us today. And I want to start by saying I'm a huge fan of your work, and I have read the Power Law more than 10 times. So the book is really shaped me how I think about VC. And the Infinity Machine has really stuck with me since I finished it. So I have been looking forward to this conversation for months because Patrick just say the book in February. So I have some questions prepared, but feel free to take them anywhere you want. So I'm really curious about how this book started, because your early books were big group stories like hedge funds, the whole Silicon Valley VC world, and lots of character across an industry. So this one is just one person. And I know the previous book you wrote one person before, but I really want to know why Hassabis.
Yeah. Well, I think it all depends on if you can find one person who is both interesting enough for the book and also has a life that maps onto a great story. Then doing one person is better, right? You have one really strong character that links the whole story from the beginning to the end. And so with, Alan Greenspan, who I wrote a biography of some time ago, his life mapped onto the making of modern finance in America, right? He had been the chairman of the Fed for almost 20 years, but he'd also been for 20 years before that a major figure in American financial policy. So his biography was the story of modern finance. And with Demis, it's the same thing. He is somebody who thought about AI from the 1990s, much before it began to work. He was convinced it was going to work. And so if you tell his story, his intellectual journey, you're really capturing AI from the moment when it couldn't recognize the photograph of a cat, right up till today, where of course it's very powerful.
Yeah, so his purity is both his strength and his blind spot. I think that line is stay with me so across the book. And do you got into the interview already this idea, or can it out just slowly as spend lots of time with Demis?
The idea that his purity is his blind spot. That's the question, right? Yeah. No, I didn't really know him very well before we started. So most of these insights about his personality come from spending more than 30 hours with him while I was writing the book. And in that process, of course, I got to know him very deeply. And not only did I talk to him, but also I talked to his colleagues and his competitors. And so I had a 360-degree view of him. And that's when you can start to understand that, this is somebody who in some ways feels very approachable when you first meet him. He's extremely charming. He's very normal. He is, open with everybody. He's nice to people. And he's brilliant. And you think, wow, that's an amazing mixture. A genius who is nice, a genius who can communicate in normal language. But of course, human beings always have their blind spots. And I think with Demis, he has this idea that he won't control people. He was brought up by his mother in Singapore. His mother came from Singapore, I should say. He was brought up in England, but his mother came from Singapore, and she was quite religious and would tell Demis when he was young to respect others. He went to church. He was quite, he sang in the choir. And so he has this idea that it's very bad to be controlling, to be dominating. But of course, he is running a big company now, and he is cleverer than everybody else. And when he has an argument with somebody, he explains what his view is, and he usually wins because he's intellectually dominant. And so the notion that he doesn't control people, of course, is untrue. But he can't quite accept that. And so that's a blind spot.
After 2 books, and has your view of Peter Thiel actually changed? Like SpaceX had him holding back while Luke knows they push for more. And DeepMind play out the same way?
No, actually, Peter Thiel I did know quite well before I wrote the book. He was a big figure in the power law, of course. And, I've had dinner with him a few times, and I do know him. And so I knew that he was extremely contrarian. And I know that, he will bet on things with only the thought that it might be true. He doesn't necessarily have to believe it will be true. Because if you have a bet which will pay out at more than 10 to 1 if it comes true, even if it's only a 10% chance of coming true, right? That's fine, because the upside is so enormous if it works. And that's very much how you have to understand Peter Thiel. And that's what people make a mistake about. They often say, oh, look, Peter Thiel has funded a project to put computer servers on the ocean so that no government can control the computer servers. And that shows what a crazy libertarian he is. Or, oh, look, he gave a speech at Donald Trump's first inauguration. And so that really tells you everything you need to know about his politics. The truth is that Peter does things all the time, which he only partly thinks might be right. And DeepMind was another one of those things. He wrote a $2 million check in 2010 when DeepMind got started. He didn't necessarily think that DeepMind was going to work.
Yeah. And for what you see up close, does Peter Thiel actually believe in AGI today? Because he told you Science A+ business model F founded the Singularity Summit and MIRI, but the book say he never really believed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he believes that at this point, something like superintelligence is coming. I think most people believe that. But, back in 2010, when he first backed DeepMind, it was very early. And, his view was, well, this might work, but on the other hand, probably it won't. And even when it started to work, he was correctly concerned that, it wasn't going to make money. And that was true. In fact, people often say, well, when Google bought DeepMind in 2014 for $650 million, that was a very cheap deal. Well, not quite so obvious, because they had to put in almost $1 billion of research and development money for about a decade before they really got anything back, which was useful commercially. So, I think Peter Thiel was being quite reasonable when he said, I'm not sure I want to invest more money back in, 2013, 2014.
Yeah, and you have watched Peter Thiel up close for years, and how does AGI fit in his broader thinking about power? And his interest in power has gotten more visible publicly, from Palantir to his relationship with J.D. Vance to founders from bad defense startups.
I mean, J.D. Vance, I think, is one of those classic venture capital bets where you support something, you don't really know if it's going to work. And then it turns out that J.D. Vance, becomes vice president. I mean, Peter Thiel, I think when he backed J.D. early on, had no idea that this was going to happen. He just thought, well, here's somebody who kind of indirectly worked for me because he worked for a venture capital fund that I supported. He's kind of, somebody who's a friend of a friend, interesting, young guy, smart, whatever, I'll give him a little bit of money. It's like, it wasn't a terribly seriously thought through decision, I don't think. And, he did the same, by the way, with Brooke Masters, who was the co-author of 0 to 1. He backed him in an Arizona Senate race. And that race did not go well for Brooke Masters. And Brooke Masters, as far as I know, is now not in politics. So you make some bets that win, some bets that don't win. And so I think, again, ascribing some,
Contrarian.
he's very contrarian. He's also, there's this great expression from the power law that Vinod Khosla told me, which is the future cannot be predicted. It can only be discovered. You discover the future by making these different bets on different politicians or on different companies or different technologies. Some of the bets work, some of the bets don't work, most of them don't work. But you don't know which is going to work. You can't predict. But if you make enough bets, you discover, and you discover the future. And I think that, you just have to avoid, with Peter Thiel, ascribing too much forward planning to what he's done, because essentially he's just buying these, what people call in finance, cheap, out of the money options, just something which, if it comes true, will pay off a lot. He doesn't necessarily think it will come true.
Luke Nozick's lightning moment was one of my favorite scenes in the whole book. And how does one person make all in code both SpaceX and DeepMind? And what's the biggest difference between the way he thinks and the way Peter Thiel thinks?
Well, Luke Nozick is a very passionate person. He's very emotional. He's very sort of unfiltered, and he tends to get very enthusiastic about things. And it makes him very fun to talk to, by the way. He's very kind of ebullient. And I think when he met both, Elon Musk and Demis Hassabis, he had this feeling that, this was a brilliant person, brilliant. I've got to do something with him. How fantastic, amazing. This is just going to change all the world. I've never seen anything. I mean, wow. That was his reaction. So Peter Thiel would never do that. Peter is a super kind of careful in the way he thinks and talks. He's slow, deliberative, grave, whereas Luke is kind of bubbly and enthusiastic and impulsive. And so it's quite a funny mixture between the two, and maybe it's not a coincidence that Luke has now left Founders Fund and gone off to do his own thing. But I think, again, we have to remember that Luke Nozick cleverly bonded onto both Demis and Elon, but it's not like he was always right. I mean, he also bonded onto some other people who I mentioned in my book, who really went nowhere, who had ideas that were too ambitious, too crazy, and they didn't work out. And that's part of the game with venture capital. So, I think Luke was just out to find kind of improbable geniuses with slightly crazy ideas, and then he would get incredibly happy and enthusiastic, and some of them worked, some of them didn't. And lucky for him, he had a really enormous one in Elon Musk, and then kind of a big one with Demis Hassabis, although of course, Founders Fund sold their stake pretty early, so they made money, but they didn't make a ton of money.
In your observation, and was Luke Nozick see the trait Demis Hassabis is really make him feel like, oh, that was really passionate on that things, personality, something like that?
Yeah, I think personality is a big part of it, and it's the combination. I remember Luke telling me that when he met Demis, he had met other people before who wanted to build AGI. And, Luke was very excited about the idea of AGI. But the other people he met who wanted to build AGI were just clearly not smart enough. They didn't have a PhD. They were not really next level brilliant. And Demis was the first person who was both a believer in a crazy idea, but himself not crazy. Instead of being crazy, he was a genius. And it's that mixture. You want the crazy idea, but the credible person.
Okay. I was curious about why isomorphic labs doesn't show down in the book, and it feels like such a key part of Demis Hassabis is taking AlphaFold into drug discovery. Is there a story behind that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, no, there's no particular story about why I didn't write about it. I mean, I wrote about AlphaFold, and I gave a whole chapter to AlphaFold, which I think is, the right thing to do. It was a very important moment in the development of artificial intelligence. It won Demis' Nobel Prize. It's a terrific thing for the future of medical research. But we haven't really seen in a clear way the benefits of that medical research breakthrough, right? I mean, I talked to medical researchers quite a bit, and I was sitting at dinner recently next to the co-founder of BioNTech, which invented one of the first COVID vaccines, the first, mRNA vaccine. And so she is a very distinguished medical researcher, and she uses the AlphaFold technology, in other words, AI for medical research. She says she uses it all the time. It's making it much faster to come up with the right molecule that could become a medicine. But the problem is, of course, you then need to put the molecule through clinical trials. That still takes 10 years. And so we haven't seen, AlphaFold was done in end of 2020, and it's, been used now for 6 years or 5 years. But we haven't had enough time to see the medicines. And so when you tell a story, readers want to read something, I believe, that has a good ending. And if you just sort of end halfway through the story and you're not really sure how it's going to play out, there's no satisfying payoff for the effort of reading some complicated science and all that. So I just felt that it was too early to write about Isomorphic Labs, which is, of course, the spin-off company that Demis Hassabis founded to take the AlphaFold technology and turn it into a medical research lab.
Or maybe that was your next book, trying to write Isomorphic Labs. Yeah, and I just really look forward to it, because when I see this book, and when I read this book, and I just want to know more about Isomorphic Labs or AlphaFold. There's recently got a book called Project Maven, and he just said about the story is the Drew Cooker is the who ran Project Maven, and he just write an email to Demis Hassabis, want to invite him to this project, but Demis didn't reply. So, and 2025, and he was saying the good guy lose. And of course, what did you see that's difference between that, or that shift?
I should know more about that. I admit I didn't know about the email to Demis about Project Maven, but clearly what I do know is that in that period, Demis was not keen to use AI for national security, for weapons. And in fact, when he sold DeepMind to Google in 2014, there was a provision saying there should be no use of AI for military purposes. And so 2017 is not that much long after 2014. And still at that point, I think Demis felt very seriously about not doing AI for weapons. And the question, I think, which is really interesting is why has Google now changed? And I think the answer is that today there are so many different AI labs building AI who are willing to use AI for military purposes. And therefore, for Google to say no doesn't really make the world different. It doesn't make it safer. It's one of those things where if there's a race dynamic and other labs are doing it, just to be one lab who says, no, we're not going to do it, doesn't seem to be terribly impactful on the world. So Demis has given up on this idea that AI should not be used for weapons.
So what do you think about Anthropic? And previously, he just say he don't want to Anthropic cloud things to use military purpose. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's complicated because, in fact, Anthropic was being used for helping the military, and Anthropic was perfectly happy with that. And what Anthropic said in this famous argument a few weeks ago was that there are two specific uses that should be prohibited. One is the use of AI for surveillance of American citizens, so domestic surveillance. And the other was specifically for weapons which are both lethal and autonomous. So, it's okay to have AI being used in something that kills people, but it shouldn't be the AI by itself. It shouldn't be autonomous. Or you can have autonomous AI doing, intelligence analysis, intelligence collection, some kind of, CIA type foreign information collection. That's okay. That can be autonomous, but it's not lethal. So it's quite a narrow set of exceptions that Anthropic proposed. It did, nonetheless, anger the Trump administration, which, of course, punished Anthropic by declaring it to be a supply chain risk, which is a pretty radical thing to do to a US company. Normally, that designation is reserved for foreign companies. And so, the question, I guess, is, did that make American military policy any better that Anthropic, picked that fight? And I think the answer is sort of complicated. It didn't change the Trump administration's policy because they just, signed a deal with OpenAI to get the technology from somewhere else, and they're going to do what they want to do. On the other hand, the Anthropic argument did raise people's awareness about the danger of military AI. And so I think politically, in the long term, it may have shifted public opinion and woken people up to the need to have a discussion about the regulation of military AI. So I think it was constructive, even if in the short term it didn't change the government's policy.
Yeah. Near the end of the book, Hassabis says Altman is doing for power and while he is doing for science. If you have to bet on which of these two motivations win out in the long run, which one would you put your money on?
I'd say both. I mean, AI is going to be used for science, for sure. And it will also be used for power, right?
Power.
So I don't actually, I think it's both. I think what Demis is saying in that quotation is sort of like, which of these objectives matters more to the individual? To Sam Altman as an individual, he seems to be very keen on power. To Demis as an individual, he seems to be very, very keen on scientific research. I think there's probably some truth in that, although it's a matter of emphasis. It's not as if Demis is against having certainly fame and maybe a little bit of power too, although of course he would say, no, I don't want to control people. But and I think Sam Altman is perfectly in favor of scientific advance as well. So it's a bit more subtle maybe than the quotation suggests.
Yeah. Nobel level science alongside a business empire from Bell Labs to Shockley, and nobody's put it off. Does Hassabis has a real shot this time?
Yeah, the Bell Labs and Shockley thing is slightly complicated. I mean, Shockley left Bell Labs, set up a company to do semiconductors on the West Coast, and that failed. And that was the birth of Fairchild Semiconductor. So he failed as an entrepreneur. Whether Bell Labs failed, it depends what you define as success. I mean, they certainly generated several Nobel Prizes and were incredibly successful as a scientific research group. Whether it was commercially successful is a different question. Anyway, that's the history. I think with Demis, what we're seeing is that he does have the Nobel Prize. He tells me that he would like to have a second Nobel Prize, so he's ambitious. And on the company building side, DeepMind is now Google DeepMind. It's got, a very deep scientific research bench, probably something like 5,000 or 6,000 people now. And it is the engine room of Google. So I think Demis is leading a very, very important unit of what is now the biggest company in the world. I think Alphabet has overtaken the others just in the last few weeks. So he's not running the whole company, but he's built the engine room of the biggest company in the world, which is almost as good. So I think he really is the first person to be both sort of absolutely top business leader and an absolutely top scientist.
Yeah, I think he's just going to the third way because before last, Shockley failed by commercial things, and Bell Labs just doesn't take the outcome of the scientific things to commercialize. So maybe there is not really innovation, something like that.
I think we were referring to the moment when, after ChatGPT came out, Demis talked to his own researchers and said, we mustn't be like Xerox PARC or Bell Labs. In other words, a place that's good at science but fails to ship product. And I think that, when you look at Gemini 3.0 at the end of 2025, Demis successfully avoided being like Bell Labs or Xerox PARC because they did ship product and it was a good product and lots of people are using it now. Bundled into the Google search when you use AI mode, but also just the Gemini app directly. So I think he has avoided that danger of being good at science but bad at business.
Yeah, and in your observation and how he do that, right? How he successfully avoid that things. I think that was really hard. Yeah.
I think the key thing here is that he had this part of his background, which was building video games. He had done this before going to Cambridge. He wrote a video game called Theme Park, which did very well. And then he founded his own company after Cambridge called Elixir. And Elixir was trying to ship video games. And so the experience of shipping product and of organizing teams of technical workers to team up and deliver a product, by a deadline, that is something which Demis had some experience of. And so when it came time to ship products at DeepMind, he brought that way of organizing technical talent to DeepMind. And so if you look at the scientific successes like the Atari game playing system or the AlphaGo system or AlphaZero or AlphaFold, all of these breakthroughs came from using the video game model of having a sort of strike team of people who work together with top-down direction, a project director, and quite strict rules about how each researcher has to operate in the team. It's not just a free thing where you go off and do your research however you like. And so that was the tradition that Google DeepMind applied to building Gemini 3.0. They had a strike team, top-down organization, rules about how you test a new idea to see if it's going to improve the model in a way that's comparable with the other proposals to improve the model. And by imposing the sort of combination of scientific rigor with video game design organization, that's how they avoided being Xerox PARC.
Yeah. And can you walk us through what this last chapter is really doing? I spent some time digesting it. And why do you choose to end the book with turning champion? And what does the self-identification means to Demis?
Well, obviously I had the challenge of writing a book when the story was moving. And so the way I, resolved this problem is that I delivered a great story about one of the most important scientists in the field, telling how he goes from a time when artificial intelligence doesn't do anything to this triumph of building Gemini 3.0, which at the end of 2025 was the best model in the world. So that felt like kind of a stopping point at the end of my last full chapter. And then I wanted to write an epilogue, which just sort of acknowledges that, look, the story isn't finished. There's an amazing future out there when Demis is going to continue to do things and think about big ideas and develop new ideas and amaze us all over again. He's already amazed us a few times, but he's going to do amazing things in the future. And I wanted to grapple with that, but also grapple with, like, who is he in the end? What motivates him? And is he good or is he not good? And so the last chapter, the epilogue, is supposed to kind of look beyond where the story was ending as I finished writing and show Demis thinking about these big questions around, is quantum physics key to understanding the universe? Or can you explain everything with ones and zeros, the traditional computer science, the traditional information science, which people like Turing and Shannon founded after the Second World War. And Demis, in his Nobel Prize lecture, had written this sort of secret line, which is if you just read the speech quickly, you don't see that this is important. But if you talk to him, he tells you, yes, this is important. Where he says essentially that, maybe in the future we'll discover that we don't need quantum explanations for as much as we thought, and that we can push traditional computing to create superintelligence without any quantum computing, that we can explain the human mind with a model which assumes only ones and zeros, traditional computing in the brain. You don't need to posit complicated quantum effects in the human brain to explain how it works. So that's his debate with the Nobel Prize winner, Roger Penrose. And then finally in physics, in sort of theoretical physics, there is this debate about whether at the very tiny level of mass, below the Planck level, normal Einstein relativity breaks down, and you need to have quantum physics to explain what's going on. And Demis is positing that perhaps you can push Einstein's framework down into the tiny, tiny subatomic level, more than the mainstream of physics now believes. And this is a very radical, heretical proposition about theoretical physics, which I think most theoretical physicists would not agree with. But Demis, would like to push on that. And, he has this crazy vision of, with artificial intelligence, we're going to be able to conquer space. If we can conquer space, we can do these enormous experiments in space to discover the fabric of reality. And he envisages something like the Large Hadron Collider, which, is buried under the ground in Europe. You could build a much bigger one in space, and you could, be shooting these particles together and discovering what happens to the subatomic particles when these things collide. And you could look into the nature of reality in a new way, thanks to artificial intelligence, and understand for once and for all whether quantum physics is necessary. This is just a sort of mind-blowingly ambitious vision. And so I just wanted to show Demis at the end of my story, looking forward to all the exciting things that might come in the future.
Yeah, and when I'm reading that, it's really mind-blowing, and especially the line he mentioned in Nobel Prize speech. So I just try to know more about that. So I just read lots of time. And there's a question is, why Turing and not Shannon or Van Neumann or someone else? Demis has had Turing as a hero since Cambridge, and what's behind that choice?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one. I think, he also told me at various times that Shannon was a great hero of his, and that he believes, like Shannon said, that information is the fundamental unit of reality. You can explain, how biology works. You can think of it as an information processing system. You can explain, obviously, how computers work as an information processing system. And so I think, actually, Shannon is very important to him as well. And, he used this phrase with me, Turing's champion. I think because Turing, took the Shannon view of reality, that it consists of information, and then specifically applied it to computing and to a future of, AI and superintelligence. And that is sort of narrowly what Demis is doing, because he's building AI. But the kind of maybe the broader framing that Shannon offers, that information is not merely the underpinning of computing, it's the underpinning of everything. That also fascinates Demis. And I think he would, if he was sitting here with us, he would probably say, I admire Shannon. I'm inspired by Shannon as much as Turing.
And the Penrose disagreement come down to whether AGI is possible at all. And Penrose say the brain need quantum effect, and Demis say no. So of course, is Demis' belief in AGI built in the scientific position or something more intuitive?
I think great science is a mixture of, empirical testing and intuitive judgment. And sometimes Demis talks about scientific taste, which is sort of another way of saying just a judgment or an intuition about what avenue of new research is going to pay off. I think he would say it's both. There's this interesting, episode in my book where he goes off to do his PhD in neuroscience. And it was kind of a bold thing to do because he did not study biology or psychology or medicine before. He had done computer science as an undergraduate, and he was self-taught as a biologist or a neuroscientist. He just read things by himself. His wife is an academic biologist. He had friends who were biologists, but he was not himself a biologist. But that didn't stop him from enrolling as a PhD student in neuroscience. So he showed up at University College London, and what he had was lots of intuitive ideas about the relationship between memory and imagination, What he did not have was a lot of empirical knowledge about biology and neuroscience, because he hadn't studied it before. He just read some things, but he hadn't done it professionally. And so he had this partnership with his friend, who was another chess player. They were both, children who were top chess players. And this friend of his was called Darshan Kumaran. And Darshan described to me, seeing Demis sort of on the first day that he showed up for his neuroscience PhD. Demis already had 5 theories about how he was going to, do a breakthrough research paper. And Darshan would talk to him and say, well, none of these ideas are going to work. This one is wrong for this reason. The next one is wrong for the other reason. And Demis would sort of listen carefully and say, okay. They're all wrong. That's fine. Okay. And then the next day he would say, Darshan, I've got a new idea. And they would go and make coffee in the kitchen. And Demis would have 2 new ideas. And then eventually, after several days of this or weeks of this, Demis said, I have another idea. And Darshan didn't say, oh, that doesn't work. He said, maybe that's true. And so I think Demis's particular skill has been usually on the intuitive side, but he needs to partner with people who are more empirical and maybe more grounded, more fact-based. Demis said to me once, he always does this, he comes in with inspiration and he says, yeah, the details, whatever.
It's just like work with John Jumper, more empirical.
Yeah. John Jumper is another interesting character. He was obviously the AlphaFold researcher who, won the Nobel Prize with Demis. They shared it together and with another scientist. And I spent quite a lot of time with John. John strikes me as both inspirational and detail-oriented, but he's also unbelievably complicated to listen to. And he's the kind of person where, however many times you listen very carefully and then you say back to him, okay, I want to make sure I understand this, John. What you're saying is da-da-da-da-da. He will never agree that you've said it back to him correctly. I went back and forth with him. And, even with written passages from my chapter, because I wanted to get the science really right, I would show it to him and say, look, I've had to simplify this a bit, but is this right? And he would say, no, you have to change it this way. And then, another month later, I would show him something else and he would change his mind on what he said the last time. So he's very hard to pin down. And I think Demis, on the other hand, is incredibly clear in what he thinks and incredibly sort of willing to tell you what the bottom line is and accept the need to simplify in order to communicate. And so they are very different in what they bring to a scientific team.
So in your observation, and I'm curious about just John Jumper is like 2018 to getting to AlphaFold team or more earlier, is what in your view, what is really Demis want to work with him and what his join is bring something advantage on that?
Yeah. So there's a very interesting story here, and I'm going to back up slightly and tell you a link between an early part of my book and then a later part of my book, which I think, even when I was writing it, maybe I didn't think about this hard enough, but since the book has come out and I've been talking to people, I realized I should have made this connection more clear. So the connection is between the video game startup that Demis began in his 20s. And he did okay with the company, but he did damage it by being too scientifically ambitious. He drove his technical team to try to incorporate early AI into this video game. He wanted the graphics to be the best, clearest, most detailed graphic design of any video game in history. He wanted the story to be unbelievably rich and complicated with hundreds of different characters. And so he just had this extreme ambition. And because he was too ambitious, the technical team couldn't deliver on his vision. and they kept on having delays in shipping the product. I said earlier that the good thing about video games is that you have a deadline. Well, they didn't actually meet these deadlines all the time. And so he caused a lot of pain and disruption in his startup by being too ambitious and pushing his technical team too hard. So that's all in his 20s. Now you fast forward to AlphaFold, and he's now in his 40s. And the head of the AlphaFold team at the beginning, between 2016 and 2018, is called Andrew Senior. And Andrew leads the AlphaFold team to build the best protein prediction system in the world, better than all the academic teams that were doing computational biology and trying to predict protein structure. So DeepMind had won in the sense that it was the best, but it had not yet won in the sense that it really could predict the shape of a protein in nature so accurately that you didn't need to use the kind of complex X-ray crystallography technique to look at the structure through microscopes. You could just predict the structure, and that's all you would need. So it wasn't accurate enough yet for building medicines, but it was still the most accurate in the world. And at this point, Andrew Senior said, okay, look, boss, that's as good as we're ever going to do. It's impossible to get perfect on this. We should stop and, do something different. And Demis said, well, you might be right, but you're not sure you're right. And maybe we could go further. And Andrew Senior said, you're being unreasonable. And Demis thought to himself, well, to do something great, you have to be unreasonable. But I should be reasonable about how I am unreasonable. And so he sat with the scientific team. And I think in his mind, there was this understanding that he shouldn't repeat the experience at his startup when he pushed the team too much and then they wasted time and they couldn't do what he wanted. So he didn't want to push the AlphaFold team if it was pointless, but he had to decide, is this going to work? Might have a chance of working, or should we give up? And this is where the judgment and the scientific taste and the intuition comes in. He sits in the room with all the researchers for AlphaFold. He listens to how they're talking to each other, and he sees that the conversation between the scientists is fluid. They are talking to each other with lots of ideas, exchanging thoughts. One of them says, oh, we could try these two things. And then the other one says, yeah, and if we do those two, we could try this other one as well. And so the fluidity of the ideas convinces Demis that he should push forward with AlphaFold and not give up like Andrew Senior had said. And so he switched the leadership of the team. Andrew Senior left and went and did something else at DeepMind. And instead, John Jumper became the leader of the team, although he was fairly young and fairly new to DeepMind. But he was the most knowledgeable and passionate about this particular problem of protein folding. And so that turned out to be an inspired move that Demis put the right person in charge. And that's what allowed DeepMind to get to a point where it really could predict the shapes of all the proteins in nature.
Yeah. And one thing that's feel really different from the power law, just before we wrap it up, and is the power law is how much of your own take on Demis. Of course, this book, the power law, feel more like a reporter's view. What did you want to write this one with more of yourself in it?
Yes, well, you're right that I did change my writing style for this one. And the change is that I use the first person. I say I quite a bit. And the reason I did that is Demis is so extraordinary. I mean, when you sit with Demis and you talk to him, the ideas flow out like nobody I've ever met before. I've been a journalist for a long time. I've written 6 books. I've hung out with lots of very, very, very bright people. But Demis is like next level. He's extraordinary. And so he talks about computer science and neuroscience and chemistry and biology and physics and the history of movies and the books that he's read and, anything you want. It's just incredible. And I wanted to capture the way he thinks and show the reader this unbelievable genius mind at work. And so what I had to do is I had to take these 30 hours of conversations, which I had, of course, recorded, and use those conversations to show the reader what it's like to listen to Demis. So I have him talking, but of course, I don't just want to have him talking with no context or no pointers for the reader to understand what he's talking about. It's quite complicated to follow his ideas sometimes because he is talking about big ideas. So the technique I have to show Demis to the reader is that I become myself the lens through which the reader is looking at Demis. And so I'm in the room with Demis and he's talking, and then I ask him a question. Or sometimes he's talking and then I write what I'm thinking as he's talking. And the trick with this is that my thoughts and my questions are helping to guide the reader in understanding what Demis is getting at, or the understanding what Demis is missing, or what's ironic about what he's saying, or what he's saying is incomplete. And I think that turns out to be a good writing technique for portraying an extraordinary individual. I don't know if in the future I'll have a chance to sit down with another extraordinary individual and I might do it again, or whether Demis is the only time I will ever do that because he's so unusual.
Yeah, and I'm curious about this one is looking back, what's the most things, or the one thing is you must regret not getting into the book?
You know, of course, there are new things that happen after I finish writing, which are fascinating, like the release of the Mythos model from Anthropic and the implications for cybersecurity, which I think is going to be a huge deal. And so there are new things that have happened. In terms of things which are happening while I was writing that I didn't get into the book, there wasn't really anything. I mean, there were things that I wrote which Demis didn't want me to write. And he tried to get me to keep them out of the book. And I had to speak to his lawyer, and the lawyer said to me, no, you can't do that. And I did it anyway. He didn't want me to write about the fights with Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, at a time when Demis wanted to impose more safety on the deployment of AI and was threatening to, leave Google and spin out. And he negotiated secret financing from Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn to pay for that spin out. So there was a whole secret project called Project Mario that people didn't know about it, but I discovered the inside story and people leaked me all kinds of documents about it. And so I could tell the inside story. Demis didn't want that, but I did it anyway. So there's nothing that I wanted to write and didn't write. There were things that Demis didn't want me to write, but did write.
Yeah, and I really love that chapter, Project Mario, and you told lots of detail about that. So what was the hardest part of writing the Infinity Machine? Like interview someone like Hassabis, who's still in the middle of his story and must be really different from someone like Greenspan, and who is in history in already done. So how did that change the way you work?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. That probably was the hardest thing, is to be writing about somebody who's still in the middle of the story kind of thing. And, people would often say to me, well, that's impossible. How do you do that? And I think the answer is that you do what I call applied history, where you tell a historical story. I mean, modern history, we're talking about, a story that sort of really gets going in 2010 with the founding of DeepMind. It goes up to end of 2025. So it's a 15-year period in the recent past. But you approach that as a historian and you reconstruct what happened, and you do it in a way that explains the origins of AI, explains the intuitions inside the science, and will be, fun to read, but also interesting and enlightening for readers for the next 5 or 10 years. As AI becomes more and more powerful, people will want to understand, what is it? Where does it come from? Why was it developed in this way? And I think and there are eternal lessons from this 15-year period that I write about. So things like, how do you organize a scientific team that is both able to do brilliant bottom-up original scientific research, but also ship product and avoid being like Bell Labs or Xerox PARC? And I show the answer to that in my book, which is a lesson that will be useful in the future for all technical companies who want to understand how to turn deep tech into products. So I think the secret to this challenge of writing about somebody who is in the middle of the story is to say to yourself, that's okay. I'm going to write the part of the story that finishes when I put my pen down. And that will be of lasting relevance to future readers if I tell the story extremely well. And you just have to focus on telling that history extremely well.
Yeah. And thanks so much for being this interview. And that was a really most meaningful conversation I have the show. So the Infinity Machine is going to stay with me for a really long time. And I know it will do the same for a lot of readers in Taiwan. And because we just spent 2 podcasts to introduce this book, and I really love it. So I would love to have you back when you got the next book come out. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been great fun talking to you.